Good evening and welcome on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Martine Croxall. I'm a presenter with BBC News, but also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are not expecting a fire alarm to sound. If it does, we all have to make our way to the front of the building. It has happened before when Simon Armitage, the poet, was on this stage. So we had a very nice chat with him out on the pavement. This event came about because I met one of tonight's panellists, Helen Rowe, sitting in the middle here, at a conference I was hosting for the Centre for Progressive Policy. Helen was writing a book, Eliminating Poverty in Britain, which was published in September last year. It's been put forward for this year's Orwell Prize in Political Writing. And when we were talking at that conference, it got me thinking that it was probably time we had a discussion about poverty from a geographical perspective here at the Society, and here we are. If you'd like a copy of this book, and it's extremely readable, Helen will be signing copies and selling them afterwards, and you can have a glass of wine while she signs it for you. For a decent standard of living then, amongst other things, we all need security and stability, a safe home, a reliable income, and help if life gets too hard. Millions of people in the UK are saying that they are finding it difficult to make ends meet. The Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts that average household disposable incomes are going to continue to fall until 24-25. So it's not impossible to guess that the cost of living is probably going to be a pretty big election issue this year. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report that was published last month, more than 1 in 5 people in the UK, 22%, were in poverty in 21-22 when they were drawing their figures. That's 14.4 million people. Poverty rates have now returned to around their pre-pandemic levels, as middle-income household incomes rose at the same time as a range of temporary COVID-related support was withdrawn. We're joined this evening by a panel of experts who can talk to us about what we mean by poverty in 2024, using their research, advocacy and policy experience. The focus is primarily on poverty in Britain, but it would be perverse not to talk about poverty as experienced in other parts of the world. So to introduce our panel, as I mentioned, Helen sitting in the middle. Helen Rowe is an award-winning social researcher, a writer and campaigner. Along with speaking about her book, she also runs a training course on the biology of poverty to organisations that wish to deepen their understanding of the impact of poverty on the human body. Her expertise in the social housing sector includes leading campaigns on literacy and digital inclusion, and is the co-founder of the Connected Housing Initiative, which worked to improve internet access for low-income residents. In central government, now this is fascinating, what a work history you've got, Helen worked at the Foreign Office on chemical and biological weapons systems and as a senior counter-terrorism officer. Vandana Desai, sitting to my left, is a professor of developmental geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. Vandana edits the widely used book Companion to Development Studies, published by Routledge since 2002. She's an elected councillor and trustee of the RGS and is chair of the Society's Race, Culture and Equality Working Group. Her research has primarily been in urban India, the poor, NGOs and policymakers with specialism in improving access to housing, challenging urban and gender politics and exploring issues around inequality and social justice. And Dr. Kitty Stewart is Associate Professor of Social Policy and Associate Director for the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion, or CASE, at the London School of Economics. Kitty's recent research focuses primarily on the causes and consequences of child poverty and on wider inequalities affecting children. Recent projects include a study of the impact of the 2-child limit and the benefit cap on larger families in the UK. Her co-authored report for the Child Poverty Action Group, Ending Child Poverty, Why and How, was published in December 2023. So welcome to all of you, particularly if you've not been to Lowther Lodge before. In a moment, we're going to hear from each of our panellists in turn, and then followed by a group discussion where I get to ask all of my questions, and then you, the audience here, and also online, will be able to ask your questions too. If you're online, you can post them in the chat function, and here we will have a microphone roving around so you don't have to throw your voice. So let's start with our muse, the person who inspired this. Helen, would you like to take your 5 minutes or so?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. How does this... Oh, okay, there we go. Oh, yep, so that's my book, Eliminating Poverty in Britain. So I did a biology degree in the early noughties, and since in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been an explosion in our understanding of how poverty affects the human body, and in particular in two particular ways. One is the neuroscience of poverty, so that is how it affects the brain. And for the brain, you've got the grey matter on the outside, and that's your kind of average brain cells. And then in the inside, you've got the white matter, and that is the kind of connecting tissue. Poverty has been found to affect both parts of the brain, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then epigenetics, so how our environment affects our DNA. And the easiest way of explaining epigenetics is in bees. So bees within a colony are all the same, they're all clones of one another. And yet, as you can see, they have all markedly different physiology. And it's based on their environment and how that affects them. So for a queen bee, if she doesn't eat royal jelly, she doesn't become a queen. Nothing happens. So it affects her right down to her DNA. And what affects bees also affects humans, because we're all part of the same family. So poverty, how this biology affects our society is what I want to kind of talk about now. Poverty is a highly stressful situation, no surprise there. The body has two main reactions to stress. One is inflammation and one is the trauma response. Both of these are really useful in the short term. Inflammation affects, helps you sort out your wounds, repair wounds. The trauma response helps you get out of danger quickly. And what that does is it freezes sections in the body. So it freezes your ability to learn, your listening, and it freezes your emotional control. And that's fine in the short term to get you out of danger. But in the long term, if you live with that level of stress, it has a direct impact on the body. And so the inflammation affects the veins and the arteries, and that has a direct impact on people's physical health. And then the mental health effects are things like depression, anxiety, and also addiction is something which people don't often think about. It's just a problem in itself, but actually it's a coping mechanism for wider stresses. Now, both of these have an impact on the National Health Service. The NHS has to pick it up and deal with it. But also it means if you can't control your emotions very easily, if you can't listen, if you can't learn easily, because you're so stressed about the very basics of hunger, then actually you're not going to be able to get the results that you ought to be able to get. You can't hold down a job very easily. And so it affects our education and our economy. And you're more likely to live in poverty. So that's why we should end poverty. The question is how? How do you do it? So the basics are time and taxes. So you've only got 5 years to end poverty in Britain, because as a government, you've got no guarantee of re-election. And without raising taxes, because you can't get elected into government in the first place if you say you're going to raise them. So these are really unpalatable timeframes and concepts for politicians, but nevertheless, those are the realities. So I think you need 3 core concepts to end poverty in Britain. Once you've accepted those parameters, you need compassion. We need to get rid of the Victorian idea of the undeserving poor. You need focus, a kind of COVID-like focus. We can see what can happen when we focus in our society. And a detailed plan that works in conjunction with the Green Agenda. And you need that plan in place before you start government, because the austerity years showed what happened when you try to make it up as you go along, and it just doesn't work. It causes havoc. So this is a plan that I developed over 10 years. It's a starting point. You know, I don't have all the answers, but I don't need all the answers. We just need to get moving on this and thinking about it properly. So if you think about it, the Prime Minister starts day one, week one, what do? So they start with the Minister for the Elimination of Poverty, and that job needs to be one of the most important in government, and they need a department for the elimination of poverty as well. Now, this isn't a brand new idea. Welsh have got a Minister for Poverty, which moved to social justice, but for them, it tends to be about monitoring poverty levels, whereas I would like to see it actually seeking to end poverty. And there are a whole host of things that can be done. You need your overarching governmental strategy that feeds into and out of every other government department. And you need to look at the policies that exist which create and maintain people's poverty. And a classic one is the 5-week wait at the moment for universal credit. So who can survive without money for 5 weeks in our society? It creates debt, it's unnecessary, and it creates a cycle of poverty. I would like to see a national system of exchanges for children's clothes and shoes, toys and books, free, so we get out of the money system. I'd like to see a new hemp industry. Hemp grows really well in Britain. It's not cannabis. It doesn't have the drug needed, the chemical needed for cannabis, but it is incredibly useful, and that could be really helped to drive up our rural economy. And then obviously housing is in a mess, so that needs to be dealt with. So how do you pay for it? That's the kind of big question as well. There are a number of options. We still have, as the British government, we own half of Royal Bank of Scotland, and those shares are gradually sold off by the billions, so we can create money through that way and fund it into a poverty elimination programme. The government is trying to claw back money from the poor contracts from the PPE scandals, so there may be chances there. We've got 228 nuclear warheads. Each one is 7 times larger than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Do we really need that many? Perhaps 150 would be enough. How many people do we need to theoretically be able to kill in order to feel safe? I think our society should have that discussion. And then there's kind of political follies. So the kind of grainy picture there was going to be Boris Johnson's Garden Bridge at £43 million. I don't know what they did with the money, but it's a lot, and nothing happened. And the other one in the middle is the Marble Arch Mound, which was £5 million, lasted 7 months, and was classed as London's worst tourist attraction. We have money in the pot. It's all about choices. And what are the implications of success? Well, for starters, if you reduce stress levels on our society, our relationships get easier. People argue about money, and that has a direct impact on the families involved. So you might find that things like the divorce rate start to fall, life becomes easier for people. We also know that in more equal societies, anti-immigrant attitude goes down. So we'll have a safer society. And then if Britain managed to eliminate poverty or even come close, how does the rest of the world respond? What does France or Germany or America do? And so you might find you get a ripple effect across developed countries. Because whilst it's completely understandable that a lot of poverty elimination has been focused on developing countries, people live and die in poverty here too, and that should not be ignored. You don't need a revolution to eliminate poverty from our country. You need compassion, focus, and a plan. Thank you very much.
Vandana.
All right. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My sort of talk is going to be more about talk about the scale and the nature of global poverty itself. So sort of try and start with giving some figures. Oh, right. Sorry, I have to go. Yeah. Okay, here we are. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do today, start with, is to talk about some of the statistics. You know, people really have very limited idea of understanding what the scale is. And so that's why I started with thinking, well, what would we look at if we were looking at this scale? And so I was looking at the multidimensional poverty index, which is quite rigorous, and it is released by the United Nations Development Program. And it highlights that there are some like 1.1 billion people who are out of 6.1 billion people internationally who live in acute sort of poverty and multidimensional poverty. And I'll come back to that in a minute itself. And this is across 110 countries. So we're talking about quite a big number. But it's also that there is a variation, and the variation is also in different continents. And you'll see that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it accounts to about something like 534 million, and in South Asia, about 389 million. And if you take together these regions, you come around to find about 5 out of 6 are people who are poor. And because Kitty is going to talk later about child poverty, I thought I should also sort of highlight some of the issues about child poverty across as well. And so children under 18 years old account to about half of the multidimensional poverty index. And it's also about the poverty rate among children is 27.7%, while amongst adults it's 13.4%. 771 million people do not have access to drinking water. And that's the World Bank, a recent report itself. And around 500,000 people, children, die of diarrheal diseases globally in 2019. Who do not have access to clean water. So it sort of gives you the scale of poverty figures across the world itself. What I also wanted to do in this sort of 5 minutes that I've been allocated is sort of highlight 2 of the areas which I research on, but also 2 of the areas which have similarities with what goes on in Britain as well. And that's about the precarious nature of work. And so I wanted to highlight the informal employment that takes place in our economy itself. And 60% of the world's population works in this informal sector. It has informal jobs, precarious jobs, they're casualized, and so on. Out of which 2 billion people work informally, most of them in emerging and developing countries. And again, there is a great variation across countries. And so if you see on your right-hand side, there's a little table which also highlights the differences in the different continents. So in Africa, it's 85% of the people who work in the informal sector. In Asia, it's about 68.2%. In the Arab states, 68.6%. In Europe, 25.1%. And in Americas, 40%. These are the figures from International Labour Organization in 2018. So again, that variation also highlights that, there's nearly like 35% of the GDP that is coming from this informal sector. It's not a sector that you can somehow ignore in many developing countries itself. And about 15% of that is in advanced economies. In advanced economies, most people call it like the gig economy or the platform workers, our Amazon workers, our Uber drivers. All those are people who are part of this informal sector itself. The other process which has become quite prominent is of the participation of women in this sector. And there's a huge amount of feminization of the labor market, particularly in this casual labor market that exists. And so 740 million of women are in the informal employment, most of them in, again, low and low-income countries itself. So again, that also shows that women are perhaps in more precarious jobs than men as well. So again, there's a huge amount of gender inequality that we perhaps need to think about. The other issue that has come around a lot amongst many emerging economies is the digitalization of economies itself, or the sectors and jobs. We live in a very globalized world. There's a changing landscape of our economies. Our economies are interconnected itself. And so that also has issues about what skills people have, can people keep up with the skills, illiteracy rates in developing countries itself, how do they cope with the changing digitalization that's taking place in employment sector and so on. So again, there's the rising youth employment, in particularly from India, from where I come from, there are 300 million people, young youths who are unemployed. So poverty is both a cause as well as a consequence of the informal economy itself. The other issue I wanted to highlight was on sort of informal settlements. I've worked in informal settlements in Mumbai, for nearly 30 years itself. But I wanted to highlight the issue of housing particularly, again, which has parallels to the developed world or to the advanced economies itself. So again, I wanted to highlight some of the numbers here. The absolute number of people living in overcrowded informal settlements is over 1 billion, with inadequate water and sanitation facilities as well. And if you look at it much more closely at this figure, most of it is in, 80% of it is in Eastern Eastern Asia of 370 million, and Sub-Saharan Africa for 218 million, and Central and Southern Asia for 227 million. So it's estimated that nearly about 3 billion people are without any adequate affordable housing until, and will be required by 2030. And there are, again, processes which are similar to what is happening here. There are processes of speculation. There are processes of market-driven evictions. But there's also the issue of rent as part of, the proportion of rent that you're paying as part of your income and the politics of rent that's emerging. Development-induced displacement as gentrification and developmental projects are taking place. Lots of people within cities are getting evicted and put further out of the cities where jobs are there. And so that's, again, having an effect on, people. Sorry, something's gone wrong with this slide. But the point that I wanted to make about this is about the shocks and stresses of poverty and how that creates vulnerability. Something that Helen was sort of talking about in the context of stresses in the context of mental health, but also how resilient people are and how continually they are coping with vulnerability itself. And the COVID was an example, and during COVID, 95 million people went further behind in poverty itself, into extreme poverty levels according to the World Bank. So the other point I wanted to make in relation to the stress and stresses is about how interconnected deprivations are, water, sanitation, housing, employment, all leading on to the kinds of life of uncertainty and insecurity that people live in. And this not only is about interconnected deprivation, but it's also about intergenerational poverty and the structural issues of inequality that keep highlighted again and again. And the final thing, I know I've gone over my 5 minutes itself. It's about the widening inequality. We all talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, but the insecurity with which people live, the stresses that day-to-day life brings in, and the uncertainty that leads to the kinds of mental health issues that Helen was talking about. So the question really is about how do we integrate equity? How do we question, what are the human rights of these poor people itself? How do we think about policies that don't just fit one size fits all? And how do we understand the scale and the nature of the poverty that exists? Thank you very much. Sorry for taking a bit longer.
5 minutes-ish. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Because I think we have them in the... I'm afraid I have to do a little bit of... Oh, no, it worked, did it?
It did.
There it is. Oh, that's good. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So I'm going to talk primarily about child poverty in Britain and how we solve it. And I don't think I'm going to say anything very inconsistent with what Helen has already said, and I think there are also lots of overlaps, actually, with what Vandana said as well. So I've highlighted here 4 key areas that we would want to focus on to tackle child poverty. Employment security and the quality, pay and flexibility of employment, childcare, the availability and affordability of childcare so parents can work, and housing costs, really, really all crucial areas. But I've put there in bold social security, because I think the fundamental thing, the most important thing that we can do and need to do is to do with our social security system. And that's because of how important it is to have a functioning social security system. And it's also because actually of all the levers that government has, this is the most straightforward one. This is one that actually they can just pull with the political will and with the taxes and with decisions about how we prioritise. It's something very easy in a country like Britain to get people money. And essentially poverty is not having enough money to meet your needs. Social security is a very effective way to get people money. And here's the basic fact about why children live in poverty. Families need financial support during the period when they have children at home. And this is true for very, very, very many families. It's something that we've known. This is from Rowntree, Seaborn Rowntree, who's the son of Joseph Rowntree, the chocolate man. And Seaborn Rowntree, Joseph did lots and lots of sort of really interesting work in York to improve the lives of his workers. And Seaborn Rowntree was very interested in living standards in people's lives. And he did some of our very first studies into understanding what drives poverty. He essentially went door to door and did a very early survey of poverty in York, and then he wrote up his findings. And he was the first, or one of the first people, to notice that this wasn't actually that mysterious what drives poverty. So when he looked at who is living in poverty, this was his, this is an age line from 0 to 70. He noticed children are much more likely at that time to live in poverty. Then children would leave the house, set up their own household, and they were usually okay for a bit. Then they had their own children, and you saw the family tip back into poverty until those children started to earn. And then retirement was another period where you see lots of people living in poverty. So what he's underlining here is that there's a really strong life cycle nature to this problem. Two things driving that. Firstly is simply you have more mouths to feed when you have children at home. And the second thing is often, and this continues to be true in our societies, you have constraints on care, you have more demands on your time, which means that often parents are working a bit less. And wages don't adjust at that time. And none of us really expect that to happen. There are countries in which actually wages, there'll be a premium if you have children. But in this country and in most countries, that's not the case. Tesco carries on paying you whatever they were paying you. You've now got 3 children to feed. So what we found, and 150 or odd years later, this continues to be the case. There are things that tip you into poverty that make you higher risk, such as losing your job, becoming a lone parent, becoming disabled and sick. These things can happen and make it worse, but there's also this life cycle nature. So very many families will need support and will be in poverty if they don't have financial assistance from the state. When we look at other countries who have low poverty rates, what do we find? They are providing financial support to families with children, often universally to all children, regardless of income, and also in a means-tested way as well. We also know this when we look at our own recent history. So this is child poverty trends in the UK, using the standard poverty line, which is a relative line that we tend to use, which is children living in households below 60% of median equivalised income after housing costs. So it's a relative line, it shifts with the median living standards, because that's what poverty is. I mean, you need to have the things that other children around you have in order to participate in society. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that in discussion if people want to. And we did, in fact, have a government which had a plan for eliminating child poverty. It wasn't a 5-year plan. They were more confident, at the beginning at least. This was the Labour government, and they set up a 20-year plan. So Tony Blair said, we are going to eradicate child poverty by 2020. And he set up targets, and they started to develop policies to try to do that. And as you can see, well, around 2010, they left office. But in that time, and around 2004, they entered a war in Iraq, and foreign policy sort of dominated, and they weren't so good on domestic policy. But apart from that, you can see that they were getting child poverty down. They had it down by about a third by the time they left office. Since then, we've seen poverty rising again. So this tells us, you know, you can do this, you can have a plan, and it can work. What were they doing? They were doing lots of things. And so there were lots of things that they were doing in kind of terms of more long-term investments, such as investing in early years, Sure Start, education, and so on. But the really kind of immediate thing they were doing was investing in social security benefits, cash benefits for families with children through the tax credit system. So what we've got here is the percentage point difference to poverty rates made by the tax transfer system. So poverty, you have poverty kind of just based on your market income, and then after the tax transfer system gets involved, how much does poverty fall by? And you can see that at the beginning of this period, it was falling for all these different groups, children in smaller families, children in larger families, and working age adults by about 10 percentage points. And over the course of the next 15 years, particularly for children in larger families, we saw a huge increase in the effectiveness of tax transfers, so that by the end, we were bringing down the poverty rate by nearly 40 percentage points. Since then, we've been moving in the wrong direction. If I just put up those poverty rates again, you can see the kind of almost the very close tracking. It's not actually a mystery how you do this. If you want to get children out of poverty, you give the families more money. Okay, what's been happening over that last period? Why are we seeing this movement in the wrong direction? We've seen a whole series of cuts to our social security system. And I've highlighted two types of cuts, really, here. The first is the one that goes unnoticed usually, but has been really, really damaging over time, which is a squeeze on the real value of support through the way that benefits are uprated year on year. So a decision has to be made year on year. Do we uprate the benefits with inflation or wages, or do we leave them the same? And, you know, the word uprating usually switches lots of people off, but this stuff matters. So we had a 1% uprating between 2013 and 2015 instead of keeping benefits rising with inflation. And then we had a cash freeze in nominal terms. They did not change in nominal terms for the following 5 years. So that has gradually made our system less generous, and that itself has gradually pushed more and more families into poverty. The second thing is that we've created deliberate holes in our social safety nets. So traditionally, we've always kind of worked out what does a family need, and then we've given them that support. Often not particularly generous, but there's been a link between what we think the family needs and the support we give them. We've, in lots of different ways, started to undo that. So Helen has talked about the 5-week wait and various deductions that are made to universal credit. There are also these two very explicit policies that separate need from entitlement, which are the 2-child limit. You can now only get support for your first 2 children, and the benefit cap, which limits the total support you can get if no one in your household is working. So these policies are what's driving this increase in poverty. Finally, just wanted to highlight, you know, how important this is. This really matters for children's lives, and Helen's talked about some of the sort of neurological and the kind of physical ways in which this affects children. We've got lots and lots of evidence on the ways that poverty limits children's lives. It limits their day-to-day experiences, and it has long-term effects on their future opportunities. This is just one story that was in the paper recently, highlighting the decline in child health in the UK among young children under 5. You don't see no impact. Let more and more children live in poverty without seeing impact on their health, and we're also seeing impact on their education. And these are things which are going to, you know, affect these children and therefore all of us long term. So it's urgent to tackle this problem, and we know what to do about it.
Thank you very much. Kitty, before we came in here, I did a geography degree about 500 years ago at Leeds University. In those days, we used to talk about relative poverty and absolute poverty, and those terms you assured me are still used. So what do we mean by poverty in this country, other than the fact that it means you've not got enough money to pay for what you need. How do you define what somebody needs? Because that changes over time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Exactly. That's what it changes over time, and that's why we use the standard measure we use is this one, which is a measure basically we take the median income, the kind of middle level of income in the society, so not the average, so it's not pushed up by the higher people. If we lined everybody up from the poorest to the richest, we take the middle person, and then we take 60% of that, so well below that, and we say that anyone living below that is in poverty, and we adjust it for family size. Now, there are good things and bad things about that. I mean, firstly, it's pretty arbitrary. There's no particular reason it's 60% and not 50% and not 70%. But there are lots of exercises that have been done that actually kind of talk to focus groups and to people about what does a family actually need. And those exercises often come up with something around that level. So it's not that is certainly a really particularly high level for a society. The advantage of it is that it's sort of straightforward and it does track over time. As the society gets richer and richer, children and families need more stuff. So, you know, a mobile phone, a smartphone, 20 years ago, didn't exist, or it was only for the very, very richest. Now, if you're a teenager in a school that and you don't have a smartphone, you are really excluded from learning as well as from your social interaction. So that's, you know, the relative poverty line really sort of is a simple and good way of capturing that.
We started to hear in the Theresa May government, didn't we, about the jams, the just about managings, and they were people who in the past probably had quite a decent quality of life and were struggling because of the cost of living going up. And when you hear about us talking about poverty in Britain, do you kind of roll your eyes a bit when you're looking at the poverty levels that you see in the global south? I mean, you did talk about the shocks and stresses, and some of those were exactly the kind of things that Helen was talking about. So what are the sort of comparisons, contrast it and compare it for us?
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, I was talking about the informal housing settlements. You know, people are living in very precarious, low-quality houses. And, you know, you can say, well, okay, you know, how does that compare to being in the UK? And in the UK, you'll see, you know, homelessness in London streets have been high. You know, you see people living in, you know, houses which have got mold and damp and living in very dilapidated conditions of housing. So, I mean, yes, there would be people who would say roll their eyes and so on, but it's also the scale of it. You know, it's you know, you're talking about you know, cities which have got 20 million population, you know, which is, you know, quarter of, you know, your 70 million in the UK in just one city. And so, you know, settlements are also very densely populated. You have very short, small spaces in which people are living in. So, exactly talking too about sort of the relativity of it as well. You know, they might be living in sort of these informal settlements, but they might also be having jobs like an air hostess for an aeroplane. You know, so you know, there is also that kind of relativity within the slum settlements. It's just because it's unaffordable to live in cities, unaffordable to have housing within cities, and you find these informal settlements quite a lot.
Health and longevity, of course, is well documented. Helen, I was referred to the Joseph Rowntree report that was published last month at the beginning in my introduction, and it said that it's been almost 20 years and 6 prime ministers since the last prolonged period of poverty falling in the UK. So that's under the Labour government, it's under the Conservative government, the coalition government that we saw from 2010. So clearly there's a long-standing issue here. But when you talk about eliminating poverty, given what we've seen, no matter who's in power, is elimination really a pipe dream? When you talk to politicians, how open to the ideas, and you've put a lot of ideas in that book, how open to those ideas are they?
I think they're terrified, actually. I think they find the whole thing far too overwhelming and too frightening and too difficult. Yeah, you're going to need a really extraordinary leader, someone who's done all the thinking before they enter government, and you need to put it to the British public properly explained, because The problem is the concept of the undeserving poor is really deeply embedded in our society.
Still?
Yeah, even, and particularly, you only need to look at some right-wing newspapers. And even, you know, I work in East London at a charity, and you see even people there talking about, oh, well, you know, such and such down the street has got, you know, says that they're poor and they've got a satellite TV. And the problem is that it's so easy to pit people against each other. I think for certain politicians, I feel so strongly about this. If a politician is blaming people's poverty on themselves, that makes life extraordinarily easy for them because they don't have to do anything. You know, so when people sort of talk about this idea of, like our Home Secretary recently said, you know, homelessness is a personal choice. Very easy. Don't have to do anything then, do you? And so I think it's really good to just press the cynical button and just question whose life is made easier by that concept. But yeah, they're not, I mean, the Labour Party is very, I've been to kind of conferences there, and they are obviously very pro the idea of dealing with inequality, but too often it's part of the DWP's job. And actually, for me, having worked in government, it's too siloed. You need an overarching catch-all so that every government department understands they have a role to play.
We'll come back and talk about sort of tax and benefits in a minute, and also how you sell these ideas to the public who've got to vote you in the first place. I've spoken to a lot of geographers about population control over the years, and there's this inherent sort of squeamishness about talking about what we should be telling people about how many children they should have. There's this horror that should ever be mentioned, it seems. But if you look at those graphs, Kitty, it's families with larger numbers of children who are more likely to be in poverty. Yeah. So at what point is it okay, or do we need to have that difficult conversation about the choices that we make? Because some people might say, well, I would have liked to have had 3 or 4 children. I had 1 or 2 because I couldn't afford to have any more. How acceptable is that, or how necessary is it for us to have that conversation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I should have labelled it better. So larger families sounds very large, but it's 3. It's families with 3 or more children. And the risks for families with 3 or more children is much higher.
Exponentially higher than if you have 1 or 2?
Not exponentially higher, no, but it is higher.
Right.
It's higher. And it's higher partly because you've got more people in the house, and it's higher partly because you see different choices made about work. So often it becomes much more difficult to have 2 full-time. So more and more families with 1 or 2 children have 2 parents working full-time. I think it's more than half now have that. Or heading towards that. Whereas if you have 3 or more children, that's much less common. It's much more common to have 1 adult working full-time, 1 part-time, and so on. But so coming back to your question, I mean, so that's one reason that they went for this 2-child limit, because it's very popular. It's really popular. You know, lots of people think, yeah, why people should have as many children as they can afford. But I think that misses a whole lot of different points. One is, to me, your decision about how many, well, let's put that second. I mean, one is that not all families make choices about how many children they have. The second...
Explain what you mean by that.
Well, we all know that life isn't always as planned, right? Many people, possibly in this room even, had babies that wasn't really part of the plan, you know.
Bit of a surprise. Yeah.
So that happens, firstly. Secondly, the rest of life doesn't go to plan. So many people who need some support are families that when they had their 3rd child, they were both in work, they were both in good health, everything was fine. And then somebody loses a job, somebody becomes sick and can't work. You know, things go wrong for people. That's what the social security system is supposed to be there for. The third thing, of course, is that it's the children. Those children are not making any decisions. I mean, then we'll get a bit into deserving and undeserving poor, but the children surely are deserving. So allowing that, whatever you think about the choices people make, allowing those children to grow up in poverty is damaging to them, and it's damaging to us all because they're not fulfilling their potential. I think if we're going to talk about population control in terms of like the climate, I think that's important, and I do think those kinds of discussions we need to be having. But it's sort of galling to have those discussions, to have someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, who've got 6 children and counting, and when you look at their carbon footprint, absolutely,
but they would say, but I can afford to support them.
Well,
wouldn't they? Economically, they can afford to support them.
That's a different argument. If they're saying that, that's one argument. But if we're talking about climate control and geography...
We're also talking about, tonight we're talking about poverty, and can you afford the children that you've...
Okay, so then I go back to the other, so are you saying that I can only have a third child if I've got a lot of private wealth behind me? Because then if something does go wrong for me, I'll be okay. So then you're really saying this is a choice for the rich. If you are a nurse, do not have a third child. If you are a teaching assistant, do not have a third child. To me, that is really ethically problematic, given how important those decisions about, this is about the way that we live our lives. To me, how many children you have is a really fundamental part of how you lead a good life. And so I think it's uncomfortable to tell, this isn't, let's remember, this isn't just about a few poor people and then all the rest of us. This is about the opposite. It's like saying, you can only do this if you're really rich. Because who knows, the rest of us, we really need the social security system there because things could go wrong.
Vandana, you do a lot of work on inequalities, gender inequalities in particular. So it's very easy for the global north to think they've got all the answers and to tell the global south how to solve things. Just flip it on its head. What are the sort of solutions that you're seeing? I know that often they say if you support women, you will bring families out of poverty faster because they will prioritise the children often, won't they?
I mean, if you go back in history, 1960s and 70s, China had the one-child policy. India had lots of advertisements on trying to control your family and so on and so forth. So there were policies to bring population control. In India, not forcing people to do like in China, but in very much sort of, or the propaganda for everybody to listen to. There are two things that I also wanted to highlight in the context of gender. It's the reproductive rights. Women have rights to their own body. They can decide what they want, how they want, when they want, and so on.
Well, you'd hope they can, but often they can't.
They can't. But also, there is a lot of research that's done that if the mothers who are more educated are better performing and making those kinds of right choices at the right time. So when I was looking at your poverty table, where you were saying about that 15 children working, and that if you look at that scale, in the past, women had children when they were 15, 16, 17 even, my mother-in-law was saying she had 3 children by the age of 23. She's a fairly educated woman, but she had, But by education, what we have done by women's education is we've pushed that age on when women have children. So women are in education, women are working, women are having childbirth, their first child, much later. So even in developing countries, that rate has been pushed, and now women are having, children in towards the late 20s. When you were having children when they were 18, for example. And it's the same that's happened in the UK, where women are having children much later, becoming much more stable, having education, getting employment, thinking about it, and then having children later. So again, that choice is sort of very important as to when they feel they are in much more economic, financial situation of taking those decisions.
Just briefly then, how widely across the global south are you seeing that politicians are embracing this idea that the answer often lies with women, if the vested interest, the political power, still lies predominantly with men?
Men, yeah. So, and I think that's why education of women is the more, the targeted thing, more pressing thing towards understanding those kinds of policies, but also about issues of birth control and so on. And women's education is the priority in most countries.
Helen, you've said in your slides, we've got the money, we need the political will. But having the political will, you also acknowledge, means you've got to convince the public to vote you in on those tickets. on that, having those manifesto pledges. A lot of people don't want to pay more tax. They don't see why they should have to pay more tax. So what are the arguments that you've seen that do convince people that it's a good idea? Maybe not in this country, but in other parts of the world.
Well, when you look at my original kind of the slides that went round in a circle, you had the NHS, you had the economy, education, and you could also have crime in there as well. Those are the four kind of main topics that you're going to be discussing in an election year. And yet we want shorter waiting times on the NHS, and poverty makes people sick. So if you want reduced waiting times, irrespective of how much money you have in your bank account, if you want shorter waiting times on the NHS, deal with poverty. If you want a growing economy, people need money in their pockets to spend. And people who are living in poverty tend to spend it locally. They're not going off on a kind of mad holiday abroad or, you know, putting it in a trust fund abroad or anything. They're spending it in the local economy, and that will then help to grow it. So you want a growing economy, deal with poverty. And so I think the easiest way is to kind of make it quite personal to people, and also highlight the issue of the undeserving poor and talk about the biology of it and why living in poverty is so hard. And I think if you do that, then it would start to change people's opinions.
Can I just come in on that? Because there's also something structural about the way that we organise our benefit system, I think, which is relevant here, because we have quite a means-tested system, and also we talk, I mean, all the rhetoric all the time is about, basically about, you know, people scrounging and living off the state, and which doesn't help people's ideas about it. But when you look at countries with low poverty rates, often they have much less means testing, much more universalism in their system. And yet they're able, with those universal benefits, rather than kind of targeting them on the low-income people, to achieve better outcomes. And a really key thing about that seems to be that if you have more universalism, people are more prepared to pay in because they see this as being something about them. And you talked about, you know, just about managing. You know, I think when you've got lots of people who are struggling and they feel that they're paying taxes for these other people, that, okay, that might not be their fault or whatever, but they're not working as hard as they could, there's more antagonism. So I think, I mean, this is about changing national debate as well, but I think if people felt that this was about all of us, if we were able to use this language a bit more about life cycle, and we were able to provide support to all families at the points when they need them, then people might be prepared. Well, that's the evidence from other countries, is that people are then prepared to pay more in.
It reminds me, I think it was when David Cameron was in power, they removed, they made child benefit means tested. And previously, everyone had got it. If you got children, you got money for each of your children. And the argument was made that, well, keep paying it to everybody, because if everyone gets something from it, you're more likely to support it. So that sort of speaks to your point. You've talked about the importance of giving people the right level of social security benefit, but a lot of benefits, welfare benefits, are paid to people who are already in work. They may be doing more than one job and still can't make ends meet. So,
but that makes sense, right? That's always going to be the case. Like I said, though, why is Tesco going to pay you?
Well, this is
for that extra, you know, for your two, even let's say two, to not get too controversial, but for your two children. That if you're on a minimum wage job, that doesn't adjust, and so you will. I think in some ways we shouldn't see that as problematic. We should recognise, okay, yeah, of course, you've got these extra needs at this point. You're in work, but here's some support.
Not to pick on Tesco. Other employers are available. You refer to this, Helen, briefly in one of the passages that I read in your book about this idea that if you're in work but you're still receiving benefits, isn't there an argument that you're not being paid enough, that the market's not working? So, I mean, that's an even bigger subject, isn't it? That you're saying that I'm an employer and I'm prepared to pay you only an amount that isn't actually enough for you to live on. So the taxpayer is going to pick up the tab and support you. Who are the politicians? Are there politicians talking about that, Helen? That the rates of pay need to be higher so that we're not having people at work and still having to sign up for benefits?
I think, it's a problem, and that's why there's a minimum wage. But also, some people are spending 70% of their income on rent. And that's the problem as well, is that actually rents and the cost of just living is too expensive. And so that's why I talk about the need for rent controls in the, and really properly looking at this, because New York and Paris both have rent controls. It's not like some kind of fantasy where the economy kind of collapses. And
But they've
so
had them for a long time, haven't they?
But there's real fear in Britain around bringing in rent controls.
Is it given that they've existed for a very long time in Paris and New York, and remember the Monica in Friends always laughed about how she was able to afford this amazing flat in the middle of Manhattan thanks to the rent controls. Is it possible to introduce it sort of retrospectively in a housing market that's so complicated as ours is?
Well, yeah, you just need to think about it properly and properly research it and to bring it in gradually so that, you might do it, say, okay, you've got 5 years to do it in. So year 1, we'll do 1-bedroom properties, and then year 2, we'll look at, and, you analyse how it shifts and how it changes. Because, of course, you don't want, you bring in rent controls, and then actually so much of our rented market is now is private, and those rents are really high. So actually you need to do that whilst also having a massive social housing building sector, and so you do lots of big things all at the same time, and try to understand exactly how it works, and give people warning. So if you rent out a 3-bedroom property, you say if you've got 3 years, then we're thinking of bringing in rent controls. How do you plan for that? I just think that saying, oh well, it's all too hard and it can't be done, and it's all too difficult. I just don't think the situation we're in at the moment is so bad that we need to properly plan and think and give ourselves options within our society.
Yeah, I think it is astonishing that we have so little control, we make so little effort to control what private landlords can do. I think a lot of the solution is in building more social housing, but it's, you can just raise your rent by whatever you like. So in this project that you mentioned about the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, I've been talking to a family who's benefit capped. They were paying £1,600 a month for a 2-bedroom house in Greenwich, but it was, they couldn't use one of the rooms because there was damp, there was mold, there were rats. It was just awful. They're paying £1,600 a month, and because they're benefit capped, that meant that they were the rest of their money was being squeezed. So they were living on £65 a week for a family of 5. They had 3 young children. The second 2 were twins, so that wasn't their decision about the third. But as we went back to them, it turned out that the landlord had just announced the rent was going to £2,000. So they were being made homeless. And there was nothing, surely there must be ways in which we can...
And we were kicked out for the Olympics.
When I was renting a property, we were kicked out because the landlord wanted, it's just like, well, I can get £5,000 a month for the Olympics, so off you go. And it's so easy to do what you like as a landlord in Britain.
There's one thing I want to ask you all about before I open it up to you here in the auditorium and online, because there's quite a lot of questions, not surprisingly, coming in. When you see poverty either lessened, you lift someone out of poverty, are there examples that all of you can cite of the unexpected consequences of lifting people out of poverty, and can it be permanently done?
I think it's one of the reasons why I'm slightly nervous about, I agree with all the stuff about the social security net, but it's so easy to cut that, whereas I would like to see systems which are really hard to cut. I think you can do it. I think for me, something like an exchange project system, a national system of exchanges, we have everything we need for children in our society, but it's in people's attics and in there under the bed and in the back of the cupboard and stuff. You need to get all of that out and for everybody to share it free. And then I think what that does is release the stress and the pressure of not being able to provide for your child.
That's done sort of informally, isn't it, on sort of recycle websites, but it's a very sort of piecemeal, community-based thing rather than, and you're talking about doing it on a national level.
Yeah, and I think, and also our hub is a real mix of people, And actually, again, we have societies which are quite divided. Even in London, people segregate out. And to have those kinds of places where everybody benefits. And again, an exchange for kids, it's also the green agenda as well. And that brings in people across the divides, financial divides. So you can use it, not just because you're living in poverty, but because you want to protect the environment. And so there's a feeling of everybody benefits, and the environment benefits, which obviously kids love. So I think you can really ease the pressure, and that will have loads of knock-on effects. I think we're used to too much pressure in our society now, and actually easing that will have loads of different implications.
Anything to add, Kitty? Unexpected consequences that you've seen?
No, I mean, I don't think this is quite what you mean, but the only thing I would say is that there's an interesting sort of paradox, which is why Social Security is, like, moving people into work is often effective, although there is in-work poverty, so doesn't always work. And if you're moving into a stressful job, that can have knock-on consequences for sort of how you support your family and whether you've got time to help with homework and all those kinds of things. So I think there can be potentially some negative consequences in that sense.
But coupled with getting a job and that sense of self-esteem.
No, there's definitely positives. But then the other thing I was going to say is you've got to remember that poverty is relative, and therefore more and more people working more and more is having knock-on consequences on the people who aren't working quite as much as that. So an interesting thing is that we've seen parents are working more, over the last 25 years, parents are working more and more. So more and more are working full-time. But when you look at the poverty rates before taxes and transfers, they are going up over time. We need to do more redistribution. So people are moving into work, and it's working for individuals. But for society as a whole, that does not mean that we don't need to be doing redistribution. It actually means we need to do more, because if you've got some people working with 2 full-time working parents, then other people are being left behind.
Okay. Vandana, anything to add before we move?
Yeah, I think it's also about the attitude which Helen was talking about as well. Is in most people would like to live with dignity, and people are very resilient in the different kinds of stresses and shocks that we've all been talking about. And part of it is also that the people want to live with dignity. People want good health and good education, and they can do it by themselves as well. But that opportunity needs to be provided through the safety net, social protection, and so on, to make those sorts of mobility steps that are needed.
Okay, thank you. The one wildcard thing that really leapt out for me, and I've got to ask you about this, is the hemp industry. Why the hemp industry, Helen? Just quickly, how's that going to solve things?
Because we need something else in our economy. We are so reliant on the financial sector, and the global financial crash in 2008 showed that. We need something which supports the rural economy, and something which can be used within the UK. At the moment, hemp is grown in, say, Poland, then it's transported to China to be processed, then it comes back and is sold in Europe.
For clothing?
For clothing, but you can eat it, you can drink it, you can put it into medicine, you can make fiberglass out of it. I don't know how. They do. It's a really, and actually Britain, right up until the 1930s, from Henry VIII right to the 1930s, we produced everything from hemp virtually. And then plastic came in the 1930s, and it destroyed the hemp industry. So it grows really well here, and the fact is it grows so fast, you don't need pesticides and herbicides and any of that stuff. So it's also really good for the environment. And it's that kind of extra bit we need to our economy.
I'm going to ask you for some questions in a minute. We've got the microphone, we'll probably bring the lights up. But let me just start here. What's the spatial poverty of Britain like in 2024? Kitty, I don't know whether you can answer this. Does the north-south divide in socioeconomic terms still stand?
I think there are aspects in which it stands, but there's also definitely interesting. So traditionally, cities also had very high poverty rates. So London, Manchester, Birmingham. London, boroughs in London, some of them have the highest poverty rate. So it's not quite as simple as a north-south divide. But there is an interesting thing that's happening whereby it seems like poverty is being pushed a little bit out of the cities into the suburbs and beyond, so into outer London rather than inner London. I think
And sometimes that's because
of
people
house-
have to move out,
Yeah,
don't they?
exactly.
Because the housing
because
crisis.
of the pressures of house
it's so
prices.
expensive, yeah. I'm going to ask you this, Vandana, and give us an international perspective here. Do politicians need to stop talking about hard-working people and painting poor people as being feckless and unable to budget and to cook? I mean, sometimes people with nothing are the most inventive, aren't they?
I think they are the most creative and make strategic choices all the time. So, I think it's, again, changing the attitudes of people towards the poor is as people who are, as you said, wanting to just take free cash or whatever. It's actually, people make day-to-day choices, have to make strategic decisions on how they spend their little bits of money, how they cook, how they feed their children, and so on. I mean, in many developing countries, one reason why there is high amount of malnutrition amongst women is because women don't eat earlier. They feed the rest of the family and they don't eat. And so there's a huge amount of malnutrition amongst women. Even in this country, it's on the rise.
Yeah. People are not very good at asking for help sometimes, or even knowing how to access help, are they? Given the definition, Helen, discussed of poverty as a relative measure, it is then, by different definition, impossible to eliminate it, because there'll always be some people. Kitty's shaking her head. Look at that. Excellent. You've got to rise out of them. The author of the book, Helen, must therefore have a different definition of poverty. Do you? And if so, could you elaborate on this? We're never going. If it's relative, there will always be somebody who is relatively poorer than someone else.
I know, but I think that's picking holes. So,
No, I don't think it's a genuine question.
Well, I think if you're really hungry, then you're in poverty. That it's that level. People are heating their homes or eating, putting food in the car, or buying sanitary towels. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, have you got Netflix and Sky Plus? We're much further down the scale, and I'm too practical to be worried about stats and that sort of stuff.
Well, so I think it's really important that we continue to use a relative measure and not sort of downgrade what we're thinking about to kind of basic destitution. But it's also really important to note that that kind of poverty that we're that we associate with like pre-welfare state Victorian times is on the rise. So people are really hungry, really not have clothes to change into and so on. Real basic needs are not being met. But I'd just like to explain that it's not. I mean, it's more difficult to eradicate relative poverty, but it's not mathematically impossible because it's the median, not the mean.
Yeah.
And it's not the median. I mean, of course, you're always going to have half of the people below the median. That's like a definition. But you're talking about below 60% of the median. So it's perfectly possible to say, we've got a basic minimum here. We're going to give people support at this level. We're not going to have anybody in our society that lives on less than 60% of the median. Okay. So you're kind of basically pushing people up from that level. So you can eradicate it.
Have you got the microphone, Mitchell?
I do.
Thank you, in the back. Have we got any questions in the audience here? Thank you.
Talking about child poverty, when you look globally, are there good case studies and evidence to suggest the most effective mechanism of delivery? And I'm thinking particularly about whether schools or whether you're giving the income directly to households, or things like free school meals is a very obvious thing, and the role of other.
Do you mean internationally rather than in the UK?
Yeah, I mean globally, just where the case studies of things like you were talking about dentistry. Should that be accessible via schools? I don't know. There used to be a lot more dentists in the UK that were NHS, etc. So just what are the other things other than just giving more money directly to households?
Have you got any examples of the best way of lifting children out of poverty?
Yeah, if you remember, Christian Aid, for example, used to do a lot, and still many charities used to do sponsorship for children, particular child in a household, and so on. And a lot of the research now shows that it's better to actually fund the whole household, because you can't just pick on one child or sponsor one child or target one particular child. And so there's a lot more research across the world now that, actually providing provision for the entire family has a better rate of social mobility in the ways of, education, health, employment, and you see children flourishing in a household rather than just, picking on one child in the school.
Anyone else? Questions here? Yes. Have you got the...
Thank you. That was absolutely enthralling. So I'd go back to this question about spatial difference within the UK, and you put up the picture there of Wales. And I was interested in the differences that you're seeing in the way that the different political structures in the UK are dealing with poverty at the moment, and whether from that we can learn what could be transferred elsewhere. So Wales, you mentioned Andy Burnham, or you mentioned Manchester. Andy Burnham's response, for instance, to homelessness shows what's possible. There have been attempts in London to deal with or look at a rent cap. I didn't quite go there, but I just wondered if there's examples that could be used and transferred elsewhere within the UK.
Basically, his devolution meant that there are some creative ideas in one part of the country that we're not seeing in others?
Precisely, and the opportunities actually for potentially that might arise out of more devolution.
Right. Yes, because the metropolitan mayors have certain powers that other parts of the country don't have. Kitty?
Yes, well, Scotland's a really interesting example. I mean, they've got the highest level of devolution, and they've importantly actually got tax-raising power, and they have been using it. They have a child poverty strategy, which is across their different departments, and they've increased. If you're on, you pay higher tax in Scotland than you do here. If you're on the same income, you'll be paying more in tax, and some of that money is going into a new child benefit. They've got a new Scottish child payment, so every child who is on a low income now receives £25 a week, I think, more than a similar child south of the border. And so, yeah, that presents an interesting example, and certainly it's only just come in, but I think we'll be able to see like how different the child poverty rates look, and what does that, in terms of other things, does that have knock-on effects on how well children do in other areas. Scotland's unique because it has got that money. So Wales also trying to have a different strategy, but it doesn't have the tax-raising power. And then there are interesting politics around it, because the problem, who's going to look at Scotland? Is the UK Labour Party going to look at the Scottish National Party's policy and say, great, this is working? So are we prepared to learn from Scotland and the rest of the UK? I hope we are, but remains to be seen.
Thank you. Are food bank charities and anti-poverty and debt counselling charities having any significant impact beyond the individuals they interact with, or are they just scratching the surface?
Yes, although it's interesting actually, I know some charities who were food banks have moved towards just dealing with the benefit system because it's so complicated, and actually they're getting thousands back from the DWP that people owe, that are owed, but you only get that money if you have someone to help you through the process. So
you mentioned a woman who was owed £16,000.
Yeah, I mean it's just staggering how much
of benefits that she just hadn't been able to access.
Yeah, because there's the DWP is such a difficult department, and the benefit system is so complicated. You need someone to help you through it, and then if you need to do an appeals process, you have someone to help you as well. So actually, I think just sorting out the DWP would make a massive difference, and that highlights it. But the charities, I mean, it's why I want an overarching system, because there's too much piecemeal in Britain. You only get that lady only got that money because she was in the right place at the right time, talking to the right person. And it's too much of a potluck as to where you live in Britain, as to whether you can get access to what you need.
And some things have become sort of hyper micro, haven't they? With schools opening their own food banks.
Yeah. In Tower Hamlets, we've got quite a few now. Food banks on the premises. Yeah.
Just for that school community.
Just for that school, yeah, just for the parents.
We've touched on this a bit, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that food banks are filling the gap in the poverty, isn't it? Because they can't, meet the, they can't make the claims. They're not getting adequate money. So what all the food banks are doing are filling the gap that is left by the state. The state is not providing the provision. So the food bank, the charities, and all are stepping up to do that kind of work.
We've touched on this a bit. Can education lift people out of poverty? I suppose the answer is not on its own.
In the long run, it's really important, for sure. I mean, you need education is really protective, relatively speaking. It doesn't totally protect you, but it provides you with a lot more protection against poverty because your opportunities are greater, the jobs open to you are likely to be better quality, are likely to allow you to build up savings against a rainy day and so on. So, yeah, it's really crucial, but that's a long-run policy, first of all. It's like for the next generation. And secondly, you can't, as you've said very clearly, you don't benefit, you can put lots of money into education, but children need to be arriving in school in a situation where they're able to benefit from the education.
Not suffering from PTSD and epigenetic trauma, which you talked about, which brings me to the next one. Are there long-term effects of childhood poverty on adult brain structure and function?
Yes. Yeah, you can see it in the brain scans, particularly around emotional control. And actually, we know now that if the mother is, while the baby's in uterus in the womb, if the mother is highly stressed or has PTSD, you get extra levels of cortisol going into the baby, makes the baby much more susceptible in the long run to getting depression later on in life.
Anxiety.
And so it does. But you can also change it because, of course, malnutrition changes the way the brain functions as well. It puts the brain under extreme pressure. And everybody knows it. When you're hungry, or if you've got small children, they get hangry. And they're kind of angry when they're hungry. And so we're then saying, oh, we'll just put them in school and they can have breakfast club and everything's fine. But there's also evidence that even if they live within a calm household, if the streets around them are dangerous, that will still have an impact on their stress levels, and it will still have an impact on whether or not they can then go into school and learn and be calm and so on. So it has a long-term impact. And that's why it needs to be dealt with, not just for children, but also kind of adults as well.
In the digital age, how does the digital divide exacerbate existing social inequalities? And what can be done to ensure equal access to technology and information for all? Because COVID highlighted this issue, didn't it? Children who couldn't do their homework, couldn't engage with school online because they didn't have broadband, they didn't have the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I was chair of the Connected Housing Initiative, and I started it. There were 12 housing associations that I brought together, and at the time, this was 2012, 2013, and there was no real cheap internet access. And I went into a meeting, and within the social housing sector, we identified about 1 million people within the social housing sector who weren't online. And that was not just children, that was adults as well. And I went into a meeting with all the chief executives of like BT, TalkTalk, the whole lot of them, and sort of said, some people, 15 quid a month is too much for internet access. And they just sighed. There was just this kind of sigh of, oh, really? Come on. But since then, we had PlusNet, which was 6 quid a month, and Labara, which is... So it has reduced. But it is a major problem, the digital divide, and not just within families, but also geographically. If you live in lots of villages, they don't have internet access. And the homework is provided online now, so because it's quicker for the teachers to be able to mark it and stuff.
This is becoming an issue as well in the parts of the world where you're looking at, Vandana.
Yeah, where there's online appointments to be made for a hospital appointment and all those kinds of things. Yeah. My mom, who's 83, can't make her appointment. She has to ask somebody else to make her appointment. So those kinds of issues are also quite familiar in many of the developing world. I mean, internet access particularly, but also just not having the hardware. And those kinds of issues are becoming more obvious in the types of schooling you have, where you have your schooling and so on.
But then if you eliminate poverty, people can afford it.
Yeah.
You mentioned Andy Burnham a moment ago. I bumped into him oddly on the Euston Road about 18 months ago, and he, in this very strange conversation that we had, he talked about not just having food banks, but also having a data bank, whereby you would give people a certain amount of gigabytes of data so that they could access online, which I thought was I don't know whether he ever got it off the ground, but it sounded like a novel idea.
In some of the informal settlements, they have those power banks given to students so that they can use the power banks because people don't have electricity or energy supply, so they can use those to, for their phones so they can access their homework and so on.
Someone else is fascinated by your hemp idea, Helen. You mentioned hemp as an industry. What other industries could bring a sustainable economic contribution via long-term employment? Have you looked into that, or are you just concentrating? You're just pushing hemp at the moment?
I don't have all the answers. I don't have all of them. But I don't need all the answers, because if you got a government which was properly focused, you've got thousands of civil servants, like thousands of people within the charity sector, all working on it. You will get answers. But I agree, we do need more industries within Britain that follow on, not just kind of for the hemp, it's not just making it, but also then you've got the processing, and then you've got the manufacturing, which, particularly the north-south divide, the manufacturing industry would help for the north, and then the shops as well. So it's a step-by-step process across the economy, and none of it goes outside. So it's got a low carbon footprint.
Any more answers? Questions here? Sorry. Making you move around a bit, Mitchell. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a question again on sort of the population control argument. And if a lot of the issues come from having larger families, not just in the UK, but overseas as well. So, and I do agree that it shouldn't just be the Boris Johnsons of the world that can have 6 children and be comfortable with it. But if we're encouraging everyone to have more and more children, which puts more and more pressure on the NHS and the housing and all the other social services, then you've kind of just got an exponential problem. Or is the incentive to have, once those families or those people are out of a certain level of poverty, that they're going to make decisions and choices to have less and less children? And I say this as a woman in my 30s who's considering not having children at all because of the cost and because of the impact on the environment and the climate.
So, well, I think the evidence actually from all around the world is that as women get more educated, they choose to have less children. So giving, and I think that's true here too, family size tends to decline because you've got more opportunities. If you've got a nice job, you put off having children until a bit later, you're likely to have fewer because it's in clashes with your job. Whereas I think some of the families that who want to have lots of big families is partly because that's a lovely thing to do if you haven't got so many other opportunities. So I think that's one answer to that is give people education, let them choose how they want to live their lives, and actually most richer countries certainly do not face an overpopulation problem. In fact, fertility rates are really, really in decline, which is good from a global climate perspective for sure. But it also creates its own challenges. We have to fill those gaps with immigration, which people don't always like.
And who's going to pay for your pension?
And that's why we need immigration. Yeah. But we have to be prepared to
Some
go with
people
that.
believe we need immigration. Kitty, you're putting me on the spot here. I have to remember I do work for the BBC, so we will introduce some balance to this debate.
I think also for me the concept is, what is government there for? For me, it's about facilitating the running of the country and people's lives. Not there to judge necessarily, actually. And I think as well it would be really useful for our society to, if you don't have kids as a woman, you're constantly asked, when are you having kids? And then if you've got one, that, well, you're having a second? And when are you going to, and there's this constant kind of thing over your womb. And it's like, just leave me alone. But it is. And so I think actually it would be really nice if our government could just focus on making our country function properly and then let people make their decisions.
What it is, coming from South Asia,
just one of those natural cultural things to ask, isn't it?
Yeah. But even in South Asia, the fertility rate has declined. I mean, a lot of the younger people are having no children as well. So it's a big issue in urban cities at the moment.
And I'm just wondering, because my time in Sri Lanka, I just seem to remember their social indicators, health, the reason was because of education.
Yeah.
And in Kerala, is that the answer? I mean, we can't really trust the politicians with this one, that we just need to educate more.
Yeah, I mean, Kerala, all indicators on gender, particularly women's education, are all high. It's a communist government in Kerala, which has, and it also has a matrilineal society. So it has always had good indicators in relation to gender. And so it also has less children and the fertility rate there has been in decline far more earlier than in other states in India.
And just one more question, Katie. You know this thing about uncomfortable with poverty. I just wondered whether we should learn anything from the Scandinavians. They seem to be completely at one with the fact that, do you know what, some of us will be poor and it's down to us to look after them. And I could never understand how they were so comfortable and yet it seemed to work. And they were busy, I was in Iceland about 20 years ago, and they were busy talking about poverty, and their idea of poverty was when you couldn't have the internet. And now it seems like apocryphal now.
No, they've always been our sort of, the golden light of we can do better. And it does seem as if, I mean, the interesting thing is that I think part of it is what I was saying before, that, everybody has a stake in that society. You get lots of free or very low-cost services from early years right through.
They tax more, though, don't they?
Yes.
The higher tax burden.
They tax more. But they seem to be prepared to pay it because they get lots of benefits. I mean, what we want here is, that's what people always say, we want Scandinavia-level services with American-level taxes. And that doesn't work. So, and we're not prepared to have a kind of, an honest debate, perhaps, about that.
I've got one more question here. Is a universal basic income a solution? I mean, we keep hearing that AI is going to take all of our jobs. We all might eventually need to have a universal income.
So personally, I don't think a universal basic income is the solution. I like a universal child benefit, which is a much smaller thing for a specific group at a certain time in their life. I think the problem with the universal basic income is when you look at the details of it, to provide quite a low universal basic income, let's say £75 a week to everybody in the country, you're talking about a lot of money, like £200 billion or something. And I think, on the one hand, £75 a week, I mean, it would be nice for lots of people to have that and know it was there, but it's not transformative. It's not enough to live on.
And some people would just save it anyway or pay for extra ballet lessons.
Yeah, they would. You'd have to accept that that's part of, that you're happy with that. But then if you give me £200 billion and you want to transform society, I wouldn't give £75 to everybody in the country every week. I think you could completely transform the social housing sector and make housing genuinely affordable. You could really invest in education and health. You could create more secure jobs for lots of people. So I think there are other ways to spend that money.
I think as well, you'd find that rents would go up by £75. And actually, well, you've got that money, I'll have some of that then. There would be ways of taking it off people.
But it's also like when I was talking about the precarious jobs, there's no social protections in those precarious jobs. And there is, union for platform workers, gig economy people asking for social protection, having minimum wage, having, not having this casualization, having proper sick pay, pension, all those things which informal sector has been allowed to get away with.
Yeah, and that's the same
across the world. Across the world, yeah.
That's it. We've come to the end of our event, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of the RGS, our panel, Kitty Stewart, Helen Rowe, and Vandana Desai. Really fascinating book. I'm not on commission, but it is worth buying. It's a really, you read it so fast. It's brilliantly written, Helen. I'm so impressed by that. Thank you to everyone who's turned out on this rainy night to come and see us here at Lowther Lodge, and thank you for joining us online. And we hope you'll join us again for another event very soon. Thank you. Have a good evening.